A quarter of Italy's population lives in cities founded by a mysterious civilization that vanished without explanation. The Romans borrowed their alphabet, their gods, even their political structure from these people. Yet today, most of the world has forgotten their name. They're called the Etruscans, and their story is far stranger than you might imagine. Even Rome itself was founded using Etruscan rituals, and Rome's last kings were Etruscan rulers. The English language still carries Etruscan words we use every day. The name, Sergio. That's Etruscan too, coming from the patrician Sergius family with deep Etruscan roots. But here's the mystery that has puzzled historians for centuries. Who were these people? Where did they actually come from? And why did such a powerful civilization completely disappear? The ancient historian Herodotus believed the Etruscans migrated from the Lydian kingdom in Asia Minor. There are striking parallels between Etruscan culture and the ancient Near East, civilizations that seem to support this theory. But something doesn't add up. If they arrived by sea, why are there no Etruscan settlements along the coast? And if they were newcomers to Italy, why did they adopt the Greek alphabet instead of bringing their own writing system? Modern genetic studies reveal something even more puzzling. The ancestors of the Etruscans and prehistoric Asia Minor populations split during the Neolithic period, thousands of years before Etruscan civilization even existed. Another historian, Dionysius of Halicarnassus from the 1st century BC, argued the Etruscans were actually native to Italy. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as fiction, possibly political flattery for Octavian Augustus, whose family claimed Etruscan ancestry. But recent evidence points to something unexpected about their true origins. Evidence increasingly supports cultural continuity between the Etruscans and the earlier Villanovan culture of the Iron Age. Here's the fascinating part. The only reliable way to distinguish a late Villanovan burial from an early Etruscan tomb is the presence of writing. If there's an inscription, it's Etruscan. No writing? It's Villanovan. Other theories have emerged over the years. Some scholars suggest the Etruscans came from the Alps or migrated from Sardinia, but these ideas remain mostly speculation. Archaeological evidence shows the Etruscans expanded from Tuscany northward toward the Alps, not the other way around. As for Sardinia, its ancient inhabitants built massive stone towers called nuraghi, probably for religious purposes. Nothing like these structures exists in mainland Italy, which severely weakens the Sardinian theory. The most convincing explanation is that the Etruscans emerged from the local Villanovan culture, gradually shaped through contact with Phoenicians and Greeks, possibly even intermixing with them. But what happened next would change everything about their identity. The Etruscans remain wrapped in mystery primarily because their language still hasn't been fully deciphered. They wrote using the Greek alphabet, and every year, new studies claim to have finally cracked the code. Some come from fringe theorists, others from serious scholars. The problem? None of these translations agree. Different researchers interpret the same texts in completely different ways. We do know a few things. The Etruscan language is not Indo-European and appears to have an agglutinative structure, meaning words are formed by stringing together multiple roots, prefixes, and suffixes. Around 400 words have been identified with some confidence, but beyond that, our understanding is severely limited. Here's the real challenge. Despite thousands of surviving inscriptions, most are incredibly short and repetitive. They're typically epitaphs like, "Here lies Sergio," or votive offerings such as, "I, Sergio, dedicate this sacrifice to the god Tinia." Only 8 known texts contain more than 50 words, and one of those texts survived in the most bizarre way imaginable. The most notable lengthy Etruscan text is called Liber Linteus, or the Linen Book. This rare text survived only because it was repurposed as mummy wrappings in Egypt. In the 19th century, a Croatian officer named Mihalo Baric purchased a mummy and its sarcophagus while in Egypt. The mummy eventually made its way to the Zagreb Museum. Researchers there noticed writing on the linen wrappings. For years, no one could identify the language until the early 20th century, when it was finally recognized as Etruscan. Somehow, an Etruscan linen book had ended up in Egypt, where a local embalmer cut it into strips and reused it as mummy bandages. The text turned out to be a religious calendar. We can make out references to recurring rituals, names of gods, and names of months, but the book still hasn't been fully deciphered. Hopes for unlocking the Etruscan language soared in 1961 when archaeologists discovered something that seemed like it would solve everything. Archaeologists discovered the Pyrgi tablets, thin gold sheets inscribed in both Etruscan and Phoenician. It appeared to be a potential Rosetta Stone. But there was a devastating catch. The texts aren't word-for-word translations. The Etruscan version is much longer, which severely limits how much we can learn from comparing them. Two languages are believed to be related to Etruscan. The first is the language of the Rhaetian tribes who lived in the Alps. Ancient authors often referred to the Rhaetians as mountain Etruscans, suggesting a shared origin or cultural connection. The second is the language once spoken on the island of Lemnos in the Aegean Sea. Interestingly, the ancient Greeks used the same word, Tyrrhenians, to describe both the Lemnians and the Etruscans. The problem? We understand Rhaetian and Lemnian even less than Etruscan. The surviving texts are extremely limited, and most are just a few words long. But the archaeological record reveals something crucial about how this civilization actually began. During the Late Bronze Age, around the 12th century BC, the Urnfield culture spread into the Italian peninsula. Some researchers believe this movement may be linked to the distant roots of Etruscan civilization. In Italy, this culture is usually referred to as the Proto-Villanovan culture. Its most distinctive feature was its burial practice. The dead were cremated, and their ashes placed in biconical urns. By the 10th century BC, this culture had evolved into the Villanovan culture, the direct predecessor of the Etruscans. Villanovan communities were typically small, housing about 3,000 to 5,000 people, built on flat elevated areas like hills and rocky plateaus for easier defense. They continued the tradition of cremation and urn burials. As time passed and the population grew, social hierarchies began to emerge. This is clearly reflected in the archaeological record. Some tombs were far richer than others, filled with weapons, ritual objects, and finely crafted pottery. Then, around the turn of the 8th and 7th centuries BC, something happened that would change everything about their culture. The Villanovans began establishing contact with the Greeks and Phoenicians. Trade followed rapidly. The Villanovans exported food and iron ore, and in return imported luxury goods, bronze and iron tools, pottery, and art objects. It's around this time that inscriptions in the Etruscan language began to appear. The language likely existed long before, but it hadn't been written down, at least not in any form that has survived. Burial customs changed too. Cremation gradually gave way to inhumation, the burial of bodies rather than ashes, marking a significant cultural shift as the Villanovan era gave way to the fully developed Etruscan civilization. Small tribal settlements on hills gradually transformed into well-fortified cities perched on plateaus and mountaintops. With this urbanization came the rise of crafts and the arts. At first, Etruscan artists simply imitated Greek craftsmen. But everything changed in the 6th century BC when the Persian Empire invaded Ionia. A wave of Greek refugees fled across the sea, and many settled in Etruria. Their arrival gave Etruscan art and craftsmanship a massive boost. What they created next would rival the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. By the end of the 6th century BC, Etruscan art had reached a level comparable to that of the Greeks. In fact, Etruscan pottery is often so similar to Greek that only mineralogical analysis of the clay can reliably distinguish the two. At the same time, the Etruscans developed a distinct ceramic style of their own called bucchero. This pottery was made by adding soot to the clay, and once fired, it was polished until it gleamed like metal. The result was elegant, black, and almost bronze-like in appearance. Both the Greeks, and later the Romans, described the Etruscans as incredibly promiscuous and decadent. Rumors of Etruscan promiscuity mostly stemmed from the unusually high status of women in their society. Unlike in Greek or Roman culture, Etruscan women dined and drank wine alongside men, something the Greeks and Romans found shocking, even scandalous. The Etruscans also loved music and dance, activities that the stern patriarchal Romans considered frivolous or even indecent. The Etruscans ate hot meals 2 or even 3 times a day, while the early Romans prided themselves on eating only once. But their true genius showed in something far more intricate. The Etruscans were master metalworkers and jewelers, achieving extraordinary levels of detail and refinement. Take, for example, a tiny pendant depicting the river god Achelous. The beard is crafted from minuscule grains of gold, each less than 0.5 millimeter in diameter. Such delicacy speaks volumes about Etruscan artisan skill. The arts of painting and sculpture also flourished in Etruscan civilization. This is especially evident in the rich necropolises found near Etruscan cities. The Etruscans built elaborate tombs, essentially full-scale houses for the dead. Inside, they placed sarcophagi along with wealth of objects the deceased might need in the afterlife. The tomb walls were often beautifully painted and decorated, and the entire structure was covered with an earthen mound or tumulus. Etruscan military craft also developed significantly. They fought many wars, not just against neighbors but also among themselves, yet these were rarely wars of conquest. Their main goals were to capture trophies, steal cattle and harvests, and take slaves. The Etruscans had little interest in occupying foreign cities. From early on, they engaged in piracy along Italy's western coast. By the 7th century BC, Etruscan piracy had grown so bold that Greek and Phoenician ships avoided sailing beyond Sicily and Sardinia. The Etruscans invented the naval ram, a heavy bronze projection mounted on the prow of their ships. Thanks to this innovation, their pentaconters, fast warships rowed by 50 oarsmen, became a serious maritime threat. In the same period, Etruscan influence expanded rapidly. They settled along the southern coast of the Tyrrhenian Sea and pushed north into the Po River Valley. They even founded colonies on Corsica. By the late 7th century BC, Etruscan kings were ruling over Rome. Ancient sources don't say this outright, but evidence suggests Rome became something like an Etruscan client city, and that its kings may have acted as governors under Etruscan authority. This period greatly benefited the Romans, who learned a great deal and adopted many crafts and artistic traditions from the Etruscans. By the beginning of the 5th century BC, Etruscan civilization had reached the height of its power. But one fatal flaw would bring it all crashing down: